Everyone is having a happy Thursday. So in the interest of time, we're just going to go ahead and get started because we have so much to pack in 1 hour. So I want to welcome everyone to today's event entitled Women in the Workplace, Tech's Role in Addressing Gender Disparity. My name is Natasha Bethea, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Membership here at ITI. Today's event is a part of a series of conversations ITI is hosting on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and will focus on opportunities to provide solutions-oriented conversation. Our panelists have been successful in this endeavor, and we are here today to hear from their expertise. Before I introduce today's panelists, I want to briefly touch on logistics for today's event. Everyone will be muted during the introductory remarks and the moderated portion of the discussion, unless called upon to ask a question. After I introduce the panelists, I will moderate a conversation among the group. Then we will open up the conversation for questions. To ask a question, please use the chat feature in Zoom or raise your hand. For those joining by phone, please press *9 to be recognized. When asking your question, please introduce yourself and your company. And finally, please remember that this is an off-the-record conversation. So let's get started. Today, we have a phenomenal panel of brilliant women who will discuss why this conversation around gender equity is so important and how they are leading the charge in ensuring the workplace is an equitable and inclusive place for women. The panelists for today's event are Amy Brachio, Global Business Consulting Leader at Ernst & Young, Dalana Brand, Vice President of People Experience and Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Twitter, Christine Pierce, Senior Vice President of U.S. Media Operations at Nielsen, and Dr. Betsey Stevenson, Professor of Economics at the University of Michigan and former Chief Economist for the Department of Labor. So before we get started, ladies, I just want to throw out one of my favorite quotes by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception. With that said, let's start off by talking about why is it necessary to have this conversation now? Historically, women have had a difficult time getting equal pay and ascending the corporate ladder, but this topic has taken center stage recently. I would like each one of our panelists to share their perspective on why and now. Let's start with Dr. Stevenson. Oh, you're muted.
Of course. Obviously that's such a big question, but I want to give you a perspective on that, an optimistic perspective, which is in 2008, we had a massive job loss, right, with the financial market-based recession, housing-based recession. A lot of the job loss in the beginning was men, and there was a big focus on men. I came in 2010 as the chief economist at the Department of Labor, and we didn't really get to talk about gender issues. They were sidelined, and we were sort of told, look, the big problem is that 10%, 9% of Americans don't have jobs. That's the big picture. That's what we're focusing on. Fixing gender inequality in the labor force, that's a nice to have, but in an emergency like this, it's not our time. I went away after I finished spending some time as chief economist at the Department of Labor, and actually came back in Obama's second term as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. And the only thing I worked on there was gender equality in the workforce and families, really. I mean, obviously had a slightly bigger, but that became center stage. And, I remember coming in and really pushing on this issue, and Valerie Jarrett commenting that they'd had such a hard time getting traction in the policy sphere, getting people to think about gender issues. And my response to her was the problem was the timing, because people saw these issues as not center stage. Well, now let's fast forward. I think we made a lot of progress then in terms of raising issues around paid leave. No, the majority of the public was not for paid leave at that time in 2015. The majority of the public is now for paid leave. The majority of the public is behind a lot of the things, right to request, workplace flexibility, the kinds of policies we're going to talk about. These were niche policies that most people didn't support. Now they are mainstream policies that the voters all support. The question will be what the politicians do about it. And so now we fast forward to 2020 and women's issues are no longer sidelined. Let's deal with this massive recession problem first, but they're front and center. And the reason they're front and center is in the decade since that last recession, women's ascendancy in the labor force continued. And women can no longer be ignored because women went into this recession as the majority of job holders. They held the majority of the jobs. And then we had a recession that targeted the kinds of jobs women tend to have, which are in the service sector, retail trade, education and health services, and women lost the majority of jobs. And then women were also asked to clean up the mess of caregiving. And they were asked to clean up the mess of caregiving while they were also bearing the brunt of the business cycle forces that were causing job loss in the country, the pandemic's effect on job loss. And this has brought women to center stage. And I think in some sense, it's fantastic because we now are at this moment in time where we cannot ignore the kinds of solutions that are necessary to bring women into equality into the labor force.
Great perspective, Dr. Stevenson. How about you, Amy? Why do you think we're having this conversation now?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it's really empowering to be with these amazing women on this panel. I look at it through two lenses. The first is the constituency for any organization. You know, women have significant economic buying power. They're the end consumers for so much, or making the decisions about the buying. You also have your employee base and the pool of talent that you're looking to recruit. And when you think about it in the space of technology, there are not enough people with the skills that we need in technology. And if you're ignoring a large chunk of that labor base, you're not going to get the skills that you need. So that's on the constituent side. And then now, and I think Dr. Stevenson may talk about this more, but there's a lot of research out there that shows the benefit of having a diverse board, a diverse leadership team, diversity throughout the organization. And so one, you're not going to have the voice of your customers and your employees. And two, you're not going to be as successful of a business if you don't focus on gender diversity. So I think those organizations that want to optimize their results have got to focus on this in order to thrive.
I totally agree with that. How about you, Dalana?
Yeah, so plus one to all the points made, and there's no question that there's a heightened sense of awareness on these topics. I think it's not lost on me that we just celebrated Women's History Month, and also the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic. So I think we have to underscore, in addition to all the other things that have been said, the impact on COVID-19 and the toll that it has taken and how it has impacted women disproportionately. I think anytime you're trying to make change, you need disruption. And so I think this pandemic has provided an opportunity, despite all of the very, very negative effects, an opportunity for that disruption. And so it's top of mind in ways, particularly if we've seen the millions of women who have dropped out of the labor force in the US alone, it's millions. And while this number is alarming, I have to underscore the fact that disproportionately women of color have been impacted by this. And if you then carry on with the other things that have happened last year and continue to happen in terms of the pronounced sexism and racism that we're experiencing at this present time in this era of COVID-19, again, underrepresented and marginalized women in particular have been disproportionately impacted. And so that's not just around job security, but also advancement opportunities. And all of those sort of subtle and pervasive ways that, down to the sense of belonging get undermined in the workplace. So the burning platform, if you will, that is happening right now, I think, in addition to the other comments, it creates this, I hope, beautiful opportunity that we're all going to capitalize to address many of those issues.
And I really like when you said, anytime there needs to be change, there needs to be disruption. I'm still that. And Christine, how about you?
Yes, I would also just like to thank everybody for the opportunity to be here. And I'm really honored to be part of this panel with these other really prestigious women. I would add just a couple of additional thoughts. I mean, I think what a lot of us learned during the pandemic was that there were certain things that we kept very private. Like if we lost a job, that was a private thing. If we were having a difficult time, balancing childcare, that might be something we kept private. If we were sick and needed healthcare, it might be something we kept private. Well, we had all of those things all at once in mass. And as already been mentioned, it was disproportionate. It impacted women more, it impacted women of color more, and people of color more. And so what that has done is it's all come to a head, and it has taken some of these things that we generally had thought of as private and put them in the public forefront. And I think it really exposed them not to be just personal challenges, but these are societal problems that demand a social societal response. So I think that is why now is that, we've really taken, years of things that could make us vulnerable as a society, and all of them sort of happened all at once. And so our response has got to be proportionate and addressed in a similar fashion.
Thank you. And I sense a theme here that, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely pulled the curtain on these women issues, which goes into our next question, which I want to ask Dr. Stevenson. So, we all know that the pandemic and its ramifications have had a disproportionate impact on women in the workplace, and especially women of color, as you all have mentioned. At the same time, research shows how an increased female presence in the workplace helps companies with performance and profits. What effect will 2020 and more than the 3 million women falling out of the workplace have on companies moving forward?
So let me start by saying that I'm optimistic that women are coming back. And I think that it's going to take more than a pandemic to really reverse the progress that women have spent a century or more making. We have seen this big fall in labor force participation for women, but let me know, we've also seen it for men. So when we put those numbers in perspective, realize that's in perspective of an economy that's over 9 million jobs short still. So we've got to add those jobs back, and we've got to bring women back. Now, the other way to flip your question around and say, well, what does it mean to companies in particular if some of those companies don't get women back, or if we see increased gender segregation? Because I think that's possible. I was near a private equity company the other day that has gone back into the office, and I was walking by, and a bunch of people were coming out of the office, and they were all men, 100%. Now, in private equity, you might think, it's going to be mostly men, but I'd never seen it so 100% men, just streams of men coming out. And it made me feel like I'd stepped back in time to an era where men wore suits and worked only with men. And I don't think we want that. I think that there's some potential for some industries like finance to really step back. And the reason is that they've pushed to bring people back into the office early. Any company that's pushed to bring people back into the office early risks losing women. And so I think that's one piece of advice for companies is you need to really think about, how are you going to return people to work? And don't say, oh, well, we'll make it voluntary, because we know what voluntary is going to look like. It's going to look like all the men in the office and all the women at home. So I think a lot of purposeful thought needs to go into that, or we're going to end up with, really increased occupational segregation and workplace segregation. And we know that's bad for what you started your question with, which is the research shows that you get better thinking when you have diversity of thought. That shouldn't be surprising, right? The worst thing that can happen to a company is groupthink. Everybody knows that. And where do you get groupthink? Well, you're more likely to get groupthink when you have a whole bunch of people who have very, very similar perspectives. I wrote a textbook in economics, a Principles of Economics textbook. And one of the things I noted as I read all the textbooks on the market is the examples were all men. Literally the made up people in the textbooks. Let me give you, a fake example of Bob. And the made up people were more likely to be men. The real people would be more likely to be men. And the men in the textbooks were more likely to be doing important things, and the women were more likely to be doing like beauty. And I don't think, I'm going to say, I don't think that men were trying to I'm going to implicitly keep women down by showing them that they don't belong in all these important things in their Econ 101 textbook. Well, I think it's just men writing the books. That's their frame of mind. That's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about their buddies and what they see. And it's hard to come up with examples. So the examples they come up with are male. The same thing's true when we think about referring people. Who should we hire? Who should be promoted? We see that women and people of color struggle because referrals are a really important way to get jobs. Well, the problem is that companies find that when they rely on referrals, the research shows that those referrals, those people do tend to be better employees in the sense that they're more likely to stick around, they have higher productivity. So the problem, though, is if you're only getting referrals from white men, you're going to be more likely to hire white men, right? So you got to have women to get women. And I saw that myself when I stepped out of government, and people would say, oh, what economist should we hire? I'll never forget one day writing down a list of people that I thought they should consider. And I looked down at my list, and it was 7 women and 3 men, and it had 4 people of color on it. And I was like, oh, this is why you needed me in government. Even if I did nothing in government else, I changed the referral system. And that was my bias. We all have a bias, but if you're bringing diverse people in with their diverse biases, then we can get through it to a better product and a better outcome.
I agree. We definitely need diverse voices around the table. So that's a very strong point. My next question is for our tech companies that we have on the panel. So what are the tools that your company is using to position themselves as diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders in the technology space? And also, how would you encourage your peers to make meaningful steps? Let's start with Christine.
Sure. And I think as technology companies, we're always really eager to find some sort of quick solution on this, but this one comes down to good old-fashioned accountability. It comes down to having goals and then being held accountable to them. And I'll give you an example of that. So we have, at Nielsen, we have such a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion that literally every decision I make, I am held accountable to make sure I'm looking at it from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective. So whether it's hiring, do I have a diverse slate? When it's quarterly time and I have a slate of promotions, I am asked those questions. And ultimately, having that accountability, and that starts with your CEO, it starts with your leader, right? And making sure that every associate is held accountable to make sure every decision is done in consideration of improving our diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that is number one. And then I think number 2 is about making sure you have proactive leadership development opportunities, making sure you are proactively looking for diverse talent within your workforce and ensuring that they have the opportunity. So putting some more structure around what those different ways of developing the leaders and retaining the leaders that you have are also very critical. But this one, it comes down to good old-fashioned, hold your leaders accountable to improving the diversity within their organizations and look at everything that they do and make sure they're doing it.
I love the accountability piece. That's a great point. How about you, Dalana?
Sorry, forgot I was on mute there. I think I have to underscore the comments of Dr. Stevenson around a sort of bias, because I think that's a part of it, is recognizing that we all have the biases, that biases occur, and being proactive about looking at your entire employee life cycle and end-to-end disrupting again those systems, processes, policies, programs, procedures, whatever it is, looking for bias and then eliminating the bias. For us, it also comes down to two core things: transparency and accountability. And so I agree with Christine that accountability has to be at the forefront. What we talk a lot about at Twitter, however, first, before we get to the accountability, is being really crystal clear and transparent about what's working, what isn't, where we are in the journey, and making that sort of known internally as much as possible, and then also externally, because that breeds accountability, right? So we show, for instance, with our internal diversity dashboard, every tweet, no matter of level, can see on any team across the globe what the diversity representation looks like. They literally have a tool, they can go in there, they can take a look at it and really, really critically examine team composition, and seeing where we have made progress or where we haven't, and then insert themselves to be a part of the solution. Back to Dr. Stevenson's point around referrals, we've had people since we've launched this tool say, hey, I see that we have a gap in maybe female representation on this particular team. I actually happen to know some great design engineers, if you will, and I'd love to connect you with my network, right? So bringing them into the process really helps with that. We also, from a transparency perspective, are going to start this year with pay transparency. So really sharing the compensation, salary levels for the tweeps in the organization. Because again, in order for us to have change, we've got to be able to see where we start with. And then we transparently share results on things like pay equity and promotion velocity, so people can see, are we paying equitably as we attest to, and what are the promotion rates for women or underrepresented persons in the organization. All that is very clearly communicated to our tweeps, as we call our employees, and they are able to hold us accountable as an organization, then also managers. On the accountability front, we've done some things like build what we call our inclusive manager badge, which in order for a manager to earn this designation, they've got to demonstrate that they're acting inclusively. So they've got to do all their required trainings and the stuff in the toolkits. They've got to have their teams do it. They need to actively support and attend inclusion and diversity events or business resource groups. We give them a number that they have to hit. There's also an inclusion index score that's a part of our engagement survey and manager survey. They have to have a certain score on that to demonstrate that they're an inclusive leader. So really, in incorporating those things into the performance feedback process. So really holding our leaders accountable. And another example of that is that for our leadership team, their compensation is tied to whether or not we make progress on our inclusion and diversity goals. So just a few examples, but you have got to have, again, a sort of system-wide process end to end that is being disruptive, calling out the places where there are biases or lack of inclusion and diversity, and building the transparency and accountability to make progress.
And I think that's great that Twitter is doing that, because I think a lot of companies are kind of scared to even have their employees say, hey, I think we're not making the mark here. So I'm glad that you're being open and transparent about this process. How about you, Amy?
Thank you. I'm going to share a couple of things that we're doing very focused on women in technology. So we launched an effort that's focused on education, incubation, and innovation. And so the education piece is making sure that we're investing in future talent to bring into the STEM fields. The incubation is tying together more junior talent, female talent, with more senior mentors. And then innovation, working through technology to improve and enhance experiences. And so I'll give just a couple of examples. On the education front, we're looking at for opportunities for our most junior female talent to be able to be in the spotlight. So whether it's speaking on panels, speaking to student groups, being out there, because it is one thing to see faces like ours, but it's another thing for the more junior people coming up to see those that look like them. And then we're also working with a tech startup, female-owned tech startup, around gamifying the mentorship experience. And so, oftentimes we, especially in the US, say, well, it's up to the mentee. I mean, they can get on my calendar. I make myself available, right? But that doesn't work for everyone. And so what this tool has done, or this app has done, is it has push technology, it tracks interactions, and then the tool provides the nudge to the mentor, so that it's not on the more junior woman to make sure that she's getting the support from the more senior mentor. And we've seen that increase and improve the interactions and the results of those relationships.
And I think empowerment is a very important thing. And, sometimes, you look at the leaders and you think that's where all of the, these big type of leadership opportunities are, but it can be staff wide, like your most, junior employees up to the top. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. My next question is for Dr. Stevenson. Will you briefly describe the progress women have made in the last 10 years when it comes to wages, types of positions, and the number of women working overall?
Let me actually step it back even further, just a little bit, which is to say, women's labor force participation really skyrocketed in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And we made a lot of progress closing the gender wage gap in that period. We had women's labor force participation hit sort of a peak in the late 90s. And then there was like a real plateauing in the 21st century. You heard a lot of discussion about the gender wage gap not making much progress and being closed. We didn't see labor force participation rising much. But underneath the surface, actually, women were making a lot of progress. They were getting more education than men by a lot. And this is for the nerds out there, a sort of stock flow dynamic problem, which is the women are graduating from college, from master's degrees in honors programs at higher rates than men, and starting in sort of the mid 90s. But the majority of the workers in the workforce with all these credentials and education were still men. But as that's continued to happen, and we're flowing in more women with these higher degrees over the last 20 years, now the majority of the workers in the workforce with higher education are women. So that's a real sea change. And what we've seen over this period, this last 20 years, is we've seen women's wages increase for women with more education, and there are more women with more education. So we're putting more women in that bucket, and that bucket, the wages are going up. We're also seeing women with less education seeing their wages going up as well, even though we're not seeing men with less education's wages going up. So that's where we got some of the closure in the last 10 years on the gender wage gap. And I think what was really important, and if you really want to connect the dots, I think part of why the Federal Reserve Board is talking about how it really needs to lean into the recovery, accommodative monetary policy for a long time, is because what we saw was it wasn't until about 2015 that we really started to see prime age labor force participation, the labor force participation of people in their 30s and 40s, right at the prime of their life, starting to rise again. And that rise was driven by women. And it was driven by women with kids. So 2019, we hit a year with the highest labor force participation of women with young kids that we'd ever had. And there's another thing you need to put in there, which is that women are having their kids at much older ages. And this is actually one of the reasons why the pandemic brought everything sort of crashing down, is that you were more likely to be in your 40s with young kids at home with 20 years of work experience and trying to figure out how to juggle it all. So that's sort of the last 10 years brought women to this place where they had a lot of work experience, a lot of education, had made more progress in closing the gender wage gap. What was going on in the tech sector, though, we still sort of had the tech sector as a laggard. Sorry, guys, but that's like the situation. And, why is it that the tech sector continued to have trouble bringing women in during this period of women's ascendancy, particularly when there used to be more women going into computer science? And one of the things I studied that really I find disturbing is what we saw was a couple generations ago women majoring in computer science and then leaving the profession citing a hostile male workforce. And what has happened is that's trickled down to the younger women who hear, why should I go into this industry? I'm going to get pushed out by a hostile male workforce. And so now you have people in the tech sector saying, whoa, there's not enough women with enough skills. Well, you created that problem. So you got to fix that problem yourselves. Like you can't say that's the problem that we're dealing with. No, you created the problem, you got to fix it. And so we know that women have have enormous amounts of training, have enormous amounts of capabilities, and are very committed to the workforce. But we still have, I think, cultural and workplace community problems in terms of integrating women and people of color. And there is, I'm just gonna say this one last thing, but I mean, for me, success will be when there's as many mediocre women as there are mediocre men. And the problem that we have right now is that anytime a woman isn't just like flying high and better than everybody else, anytime a person of color isn't flying high and better than everybody else, oh, it's affirmative action that got them that role. Meanwhile, some mediocre white guy slips by and everybody's like, well, like they don't even notice his mediocrity. Look, there's going to be mediocre people in every workforce, and we need them to be as diverse as the people who are really top performers.
Dr. Stevenson, I'm glad you mentioned that. Some people might think that might be a little, provocative, just talking about how males, like the white male, can, come into the same work environment and, maybe put towards half the energy that women put towards. And, they get praised and highlighted for that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think, we probably all experience that here. So I love that. My next question is specifically for Christine. So we know that Nielsen interacts directly with all consumers of all sorts. A recent article on your website mentions that women are still missing on screen, in advertising, and in the boardrooms. The pandemic has only compounded the pressure women are facing today, threatening to roll back the progress we've made. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, and I think it kind of goes back to the very first question you asked, which is, why now? I think we're coming into this with a set of facts where women do work more disproportionately in the sectors that were most adversely impacted by the pandemic. And I think, again, it has compounded, but I also want to say that I'm really optimistic. So when you say, is it going to roll back the progress that we've made? When I hear Dr. Stevenson make the comment that, no, we've come too far, I think that is a positive way to look at it, but I think it's going to take a lot of work for us to do that. And the way for us to do that is to ensure that we are ensuring that we have jobs available, and ensuring that we have the remote opportunities, and ensuring that those different positions that we need to make more flexible, that we do that. So I think it's a combination of we came a long way. We have definitely been confronted with a lot of things happening at once and compounding and having this impact on us that's causing us to say, whoa, is this gonna set us back? I believe we can get back on the right track, but it's going to take work, and it's going to be work at the personal level, but work at the professional, societal level to do that.
Yes, and that shift is just going to be so important. So I'm glad that you shared that. My next question is for Dalana. In March of 2020, Twitter pledged that half of its workforce would be female by 2025. Currently, the numbers are over 40%. Would you discuss how Twitter was able to come up with this 50% goal, and how were you able to, achieve the goal of getting to 40% in such a short amount of time?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Twitter, as we say, is on a really sort of dedicated and focused journey to being one of the most diverse and inclusive tech companies out there. primarily because we recognize that there's really no other company whose service plays the culture shaping role that ours does. And so we have not just an opportunity, but we've got an incredible responsibility to realize that vision. So we landed very simply on our global gender goal of 50% because half of the global population is women. But in far too many decisions of consequence and ideas put forth and actions need to be taken, women are not fully taken into account. Their voices are not heard. They're not at the table. Pick your example. And we know that that can never be true at Twitter. And so we articulated the 50%. I think we are 43% right now. That is up 13% in the past few years. And we are on track and on pace to meet that objective. I think in terms of how we attribute the progress that we've made, it's a combination of efforts to really attract women and people from diverse backgrounds, and then also doubling down on programs that ensure there is a culture where everyone can, I know it sounds cliche at this point, but really bring their full selves, be their authentic selves, and feel like they belong. That's incredibly important. We heard previously about the fact that, women were no longer interested in computer science careers because of the hostile work environment. We talk about inclusion and diversity at Twitter and put inclusion first for a reason. You don't invite anyone to your home if it's not cleaned up, right? And that's how we are approaching things at Twitter. So really making sure that we've got the culture and environment to honor and respect and amplify the voices of women, and at the same time, and ensuring all the programs support that, and at the same time, really doubling down on our recruiting efforts. And I got to give a shout out to my recruiting team at Twitter that just works tirelessly to, one, meet the talent where they are. The talent is there, so I don't want to hear it's a pipeline problem. We are lazy as an industry. And so we have to do better at meeting the talent where they are. And we also have to invest in emerging talent. You heard Dr. Stevenson talk about this as well. We've got to solve for the fact that we may have discouraged folks from not being interested in computer science. And so what are we doing in terms of building investments and building talent? We have started for example, an apprenticeship program at Twitter to develop and support emerging talent around the world. And I think we also have to start being much more flexible and creative with how we view what top talent or great talent looks like. Far too often, we want everything to fit this very buttoned up profile of number of years of experience or certain education from certain institutions, et cetera, which just reinforces those biases and reinforces the exclusion of women and underrepresented minorities in the workplace. So going to non-traditional schools, if you will, and really being creative with how we bring people into the organization. Like all of those things are how we're thinking about trying to make progress on that really, really wicked problem that we all have.
And that's awesome. It really seems like Twitter is doing a great job just with the concept of psychological safety, where your employees can just come there and bring their true selves to work and have a voice and, be involved in the process of making the organization great. So I'm glad that you shared that. Amy, my question is for you. You were interviewed last year in an article for medium.com where you discussed how two women that believed in you and your work helped propel you through your career. Can you talk about, that experience and, now that you're in a leadership position, how do you, give back and help others, come up in their careers?
Yeah, so this is the story of two of my favorite clients, Rose and Kathy, and they were not two of my easiest clients by far. But both of them just really believed in me. And so I started with working with Rose when I was a senior manager, which is the level below partner. She needed us to go in front of the CEO and his direct reports to present the results of what we were doing. And she said, Amy, I need you to come with me. And I went back to the partner and said, oh, Rose asked me to come with her to this meeting. And his response was, well, normally a partner does that. I'm like, okay, let me tell Rose. And so I told Rose, and Rose said, you can bring whoever you want to bring with you. You're presenting. You're the one who did the work. You're the one who knows the work. And so that then fed into my promotion case to partner, because I was viewed as the person who had the credibility, the gravitas to present at that level. Dial forward about 4 years, and Rose calls again. It's after the credit crisis. I'm dating myself. And their bank needed help, and it was a big regulatory issue. And she told the CEO, this time Kathy, the CEO of this business unit, we need help and you need to talk to Amy. So we got the work, and then Kathy had to present to the board. And at this point, I'm a 3rd-year partner. And Kathy says, Amy, I want you to come to the board with me. We've got to present where we stand. And so I go to the more senior partner, and he says, well, normally a more senior partner presents to the board. And I said, okay. And I went back to Kathy, and she said, I don't care who you bring with you. Almost the same words Rose used, but you're the one presenting. And she went on to say, have you presented to a board? Here's the level at which you present the information. Oh, there's this annoying microphone. You have to use the green button to talk, the red button to stop talking, and got me really comfortable. So then it went extraordinarily well. The next sessions that came up, the senior partner didn't come because he didn't do anything in coming. I did the speaking. And that propelled me as the junior partner who was board ready within the partnership. And so I think about that in how they believed in me. They put me in the position when someone else said, oh, maybe I should do it. They said, no, Amy's going to do it. And then they took the extra steps to make sure I was ready and would be successful. And I applied that to how I support the women that I work with.
That's a great story. So I think it kind of segues into a question that we have in the chat. And I just want to remind all of our audience to drop any questions that you have that you want the panelists to answer. So one of the questions that we have was, what have you all done in your organizations to become an ally or to push women to another level? And how do you support other women? So I'm just going to open up, and whoever wants to jump in on that, feel free.
Yeah, I can just share. At Twitter, this is really big for us, and it's about sort of creating that culture that I talked about earlier. Some people naturally know how to be an ally and how to show up as one. Other people sort of need to be trained and educated on it. So we've spent an incredible amount of time talking about what it looks like to be an ally, giving really concrete examples of that. And we have a formal training for that. And then throughout our experience with our business resource groups, we talk about the spirit of allyship and ensure that managers in particular are supporting individuals who are in business resource groups to support their work and sort of showing up as an ally. I want to be clear, though, that I have never met a woman personally, I'm not saying that there aren't, who was not willing to be an ally for another woman. So when we talk about allyship, I want to get really crystal clear that we need men to show up as allies. There's still a greater proportion of leadership roles, often commanding conversations, meetings, etc. And so that's where the training and the education needs to really happen. We have to have the commitment for men to do a better job of amplifying women's voices, creating opportunities for women in the organization, and creating space for them to step into sort of their full power and authenticity at work. And so that's sort of the focus for us at Twitter right now.
I can jump in. So I actively participate and sponsor in the programs that we have around advancing women. But in addition to that, I just watch for opportunities for representation. And so if I'm hearing about a meeting that's happening that's about where our business is heading, and I don't see that there's representation of women at the table, I say, there aren't enough women coming to this to discuss our future. Who do we want to make sure is engaged? I differentially invest in coaching and mentoring female, up-and-coming female leaders. And when they ask me, what can I do for you? I say what I'm doing for you. If you can differentially invest in those coming up behind you, that's how we're going to make a difference. And I think those things are so important.
So I was just going to jump in and say, there's a literature that tries to look at mentoring and a literature that looks at sponsorship. And I think understanding the difference between the two is really important, and sponsorship makes a huge difference. And the difference is, I think, between sort of passive and active. So sponsorship is really active. It's the kind of thing that Amy, you got from Rose, that looking for an opportunity and pushing you forward. It's what you just described, where you're sort of looking at where there are holes and who you can push into it. When I'm in a mentoring role, I like to see myself more as a sponsor, which is that I'm going to find what's the place that, how do I push you forward? Because how am I your advocate? And I think that, what we see is that men have advocates. There's somebody who's going to go to bat for them. And a lot of the times in organizations, women just don't have an advocate. They don't have somebody willing to go to bat. And so I really want to also highlight Dalana's point that they need men going to bat for them. That's just really, that's really, really important. That is, I think we just don't see enough of that.
I would just add to that. I think, looking at it from a perspective of what you owe your team as a manager, it really, if you're managing a team, that advocacy is so important. And also the coaching to make sure when they do have that opportunity. That's what I loved about Amy's story, is it's not just giving the example, it's also coaching. And I think, doing that every opportunity that you have, but especially if you're managing people, you have that opportunity. So shining the light on your team members, but not just throwing them out there and sink or swim, but actually making sure that they have what they need to be successful, I think, is also a critical component.
That was some great advice. And one of the questions that have come up in the chat, and I think this, as women, we have to, we have families, we have kids. So what advice do you have for a mother trying to re-enter the workforce after taking some time off to care for her family, while also trying to make a career change? Now, I don't know if you all had experience of working with someone like that, but if you can share some advice around that, that would be great.
Well, this is one of the things that that I study and I care a lot about, which is that we have a lot of what I call off-ramps for women's careers, ways in which they can leave. And we don't have very many on-ramps, which is ways for them to re-enter after, say, taking time out of the workforce to, care for an elderly parent, a sick partner, or children. And so I think we have to not just ask what women can do, but we have to, I would urge all of you to think about what your company can do to bring someone in who has a 2-year gap. And I think the tech sector is the worst in this, because you're just like, this person's a dinosaur. They haven't worked in 2 years. The whole industry is different now. And the industry does move fast, but you can also bring people up to speed pretty darn quickly. One piece of advice is the industry should take some responsibility. For the individual woman, this is where you need that sponsor. You've got to find someone that's going to help you find your niche. I think that the reality is, depending on the sector, but doing some kind of project-based work to show that you've gotten back in the thick of things can be really helpful. Signal to employers that you really are there and you're integrated. So like telling you to do gig work seems like the world's worst advice, but that does seem to be one of the ways in which people can get their toe back in the water. And sometimes it means getting some new training, but be careful with that, because often, particularly when you're mid-career, really people are looking for work experience, and just adding another degree, it's just giving you more time away from that work experience, and that can end up backfiring on you.
Thank you for that share. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I wanted to ask the question to all of the panelists: what do you want to see accomplished in the next 6 to 12 months within the tech industry regarding women re-entering the workforce or ascending the corporate ladder? What would you like to see as the measure of success for this? And we can start with Amy. I'm just looking at you.
That's fine. I think what I want to see is just more. I want to see more around women benefiting from a career in technology. I want to see more women in leadership and influential roles at tech companies. And I want to see more of women benefiting from just what tech brings to society. And I think those are measurable, but that it'd be great if 6 to 12 months from now, we look back and we see more.
How about you, Christine?
Completely agree. And I think it kind of comes down to one of the discussions that we've had today, which is around the impacts the pandemic has had and how that has led to at least some statistics indicating that there's been a rollback. And so to me, it's coming back. It's recovering from that rollback and then having a path forward that gets us right back on that right track towards equality. So that to me is if we can see that in 6 to 12 months, we should be on the better path for the long term.
Thank you, Dalana.
Yeah, I just again have to echo the previous comments. In addition to more accelerated progress, 6 to 12 months is a relatively short period of time, but I do think this is, as I said earlier, a unique moment that we have to leverage and we have to take advantage of, and have to be really clear that it needs to be a continuous sort of movement as opposed to just a moment. And then I think that Dr. Stevenson's previous point on returnships. So as we understand the current environment that we're in, like what are we actively doing to formalize an approach to bring displaced workers, women in particular, back into the workforce? And being super creative and flexible about what that looks like. It can't look like it used to. The experiences that people have had over the past year in particular, but past couple of years, have completely reshaped how people expect to work, how they can work. And we have to reframe our thinking and our organizations such that we can sort of meet those needs, if you will. Too often, organizations hold on to really where they're built to operationalize around efficiency, right? Which means that by its very nature, it's structured sort of one way, or there's like limited flexibility. We can't work that any way anymore. To bring more women in and to bring more diverse individuals in, we've got to change our thinking and have more personalized and flexible solutions, such that people can find ways to participate that meet their needs. So I hope, in addition to accelerating our progress, that we start to completely rethink how we as organizations structure employment opportunities for the new workforce.
So let me just add one lens that hasn't been taken to this, because particularly 6 to 12 months, you know what I want to see the tech sector do? Help get paid family leave passed, help make sure that there's paid sick days. There's a national debate coming. Companies always have an outsized role in these national debates, and you can either be an ally or not here. So I would urge the tech sector to be an ally in helping to create a social structure that supports working families.
I love that, because the tech sector is like the most progressive in terms of paid leave. So we maybe operate like our work is done here. So I love the challenge for us to show up and help push that legislation in other industries to do the same.
Yes, I love that as well. And, we're right at time, but I do, want to give the panelists today just one last opportunity to drop any gems that you haven't dropped yet, or any last words you want to say. And I think we might have to do a part 2 of this, because we are getting a lot of questions, and it's just, I'm sad that we can't fit it all in an hour. But if there are any lasting words you just want to drop to our audience today, I would really appreciate it.
I'm happy to share. I think, as we're all really lucky with the seats that we have. And there was a while earlier in my career where I worried about raising my hand and saying, where are all the women? And why are we, sponsoring, like Dr. Stevenson said. And now I just think wherever we are within the organization, we're beholden to do it. And so if you see a situation in which there aren't enough women reflected, say it, and say it so that we get it remedied.
I would just add, don't lose this moment that we have in time where we have the focus, and this is the opportunity to make some long-lasting social change.
I'll offer, because we talked a little bit about pay equity, and I think there was another question in there. I am hopeful for a time where we don't just talk about being equal to men, but we talk about our pay being commensurate with our background and experience. I think far too often we have had to work harder, be more educated, have more experience just to get to the same place. So I actually don't want equal, because I don't want to be paid what a mediocre person is paid. As Dr. Stevenson said, I want pay commensurate with my my background experience and my worth. So I am encouraging everyone listening and all women to make sure that you continue to advocate for yourself to get the pay that is reflective of what you're bringing to the table.
So I am going to end by reading you a stanza from a poem I've been thinking a lot about over the last year called John Brown's Body. And the stanza is, sometimes there comes a crack in time itself. Sometimes the earth is torn by something blind. Sometimes an image that has stood so long, it seems implanted as the polar star, is moved against an unfathomable force that suddenly will not have it anymore. So I hope this is our crack in time.
I love it. So I would like to thank all of our panelists today for the phenomenal conversation. I'm fired up to go back to work and do what I need to do to make sure that, women in my workplace feel included and, like they have a voice at the table. And I hope all the audience members as well want to do the same. And, we'll work on scheduling another event because this was just awesome. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And we hope to see you at our next event in the future. To learn more about ITI and some of the things that we're doing, you can visit our website at itic.org, or you can follow us on Twitter at ITI_tech tweets. So that will do it today. So thank you, ladies, so much. And I am looking forward to hearing more about all the phenomenal things you're doing. And let's keep the thing going. Let's support women.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.